In the late 1800s, when the Wild West was still wild, and the line between right and wrong was often blurred by dust and gunpowder, three brothers from Missouri would make their mark on history, not as heroes, but as outlaws. Their names were Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton, and together they became the Dalton Gang. But before they became the most feared bandits in Kansas and the Oklahoma Territory, the Daltons were just ordinary boys. They grew up in a large, struggling family that believed in hard work and strong faith. Their mother, Adeline Dalton, raised 12 children, often alone after their father died. Life on the frontier was never easy. Money was tight, and survival meant long days in the fields and cold nights with little food. Despite the hardships, the Dalton family had a reputation for honesty and courage. The boys were raised to respect the law and to help their neighbors. And for a time, that's exactly what they did. As young men, Grat and Bob Dalton joined the U.S. Marshals. They wore badges and swore oaths to protect the peace across the dangerous, lawless territories of the West. They chased bandits, guarded stagecoaches, and arrested cattle rustlers. Their names were respected. People trusted them, but being a lawman back then wasn't easy, and it sure didn't pay well. The territories were vast, the days were long, and the pay was barely enough to survive. They risked their lives every single day, while rich railroad companies and corrupt officials grew wealthier with every passing train. Bob Dalton, the youngest of the Lawmen brothers, started to feel that the system was broken. He saw injustice everywhere, poor families losing land, lawmen dying for low pay, and criminals walking free because of money and influence. And somewhere inside him, a dangerous thought began to grow. What if, Bob wondered, we stopped chasing outlaws and started becoming them? At first, it sounded like madness. Grat and Emmett didn't believe him. They were lawmen, not thieves. But Bob was persuasive. He was charming, confident, and bold. He said the railroad companies had been robbing people for years, and maybe it was time the people took something back. At first, it wasn't about greed. It was about pride, revenge, and survival. And that's how the Dalton brothers took their first step onto a path that would change their lives forever. Their first robbery was small, just a train job in 1890. They knew how trains operated, where the guards stood, and when the strong boxes were moved. They had learned all that from their time as marshals. That night, under the cover of darkness, the Dalton brothers and a few trusted friends stopped a California express train. There was no blood, no chaos, no mistakes. They were quick, organized, and confident. The next morning, newspapers called it one of the smoothest robberies in recent memory. No one knew who did it. But soon, whispers started spreading through the saloons and back alleys. Could it be the Dalton boys? The lawmen? The idea shocked people, men who once wore badges, now wearing masks. By 1891, the Dalton Gang had grown. They weren't just three brothers anymore. They were a full-fledged band of outlaws, robbing banks and trains across Kansas and Oklahoma. Each job was more daring than the last. They became skilled at disappearing into the plains, hiding in the rugged canyons of Indian Territory, and striking again when least expected. The newspapers called them the New Jesse James Gang, and Bob Dalton, proud of his new title, loved every word of it. But not everyone in the family was proud. Their older brother, Frank Dalton, once a respected U.S. Marshal, had been killed years earlier while enforcing the law. Their mother had begged them not to follow the same road, but the Dalton brothers had already gone too far. While Bob and Grat enjoyed the outlaw fame, Emmett Dalton, the youngest, began to feel guilt. He still believed in honor. He wasn't like his brothers, but he couldn't leave them, not now. Family meant everything to him. He often said later, "I rode because they were my brothers, and I couldn't let them ride alone." That loyalty, that unshakable family bond, would later save his life and cost the others theirs. By 1892, the Dalton Gang had become legends of the Wild West. They were wanted in multiple states. Posters with their faces hung in every post office and saloon. The reward for their capture was enough to buy a small ranch, but the Daltons weren't done yet. Bob wanted one final score, something that would make their names immortal. He wanted to pull off the biggest bank robbery in history. Not one bank, but two at the same time. His brothers tried to talk him out of it. Grat warned him. Emmett begged him. But Bob was determined. He wanted to go down in history, not as another outlaw, but as the greatest one who ever lived. And so, on the morning of October 5th, 1892, the Dalton Gang rode into Coffeyville, Kansas, their hometown, to attempt the impossible. They didn't know it yet, but this would be their final ride, the day that would make them legends, and end their story in blood and gunfire. On the morning of October 5th, 1892, the town of Coffeyville, Kansas began like any other. The streets were quiet, the air was cool, and the townspeople went about their usual routines. No one knew that within the next half hour, their small town would become the site of one of the most violent gunfights in Western history. At the edge of town, 5 men rode in slowly. Their horses were tired, covered in dust from a long ride through the Kansas plains. They looked like travelers, wearing long coats and wide-brimmed hats pulled low to hide their faces. But under those coats were rifles, revolvers, and dynamite. They were Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Emmett Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell, the last surviving members of the Dalton Gang. Their mission that day was daring, maybe even foolish. Bob Dalton had made up his mind. They were going to rob 2 banks at the same time, right there in Coffeyville, the town where they had once lived and grown up. Bob believed this would be their final, glorious job, a robbery so bold that their names would live forever in legend. But deep down, even his brothers felt uneasy. Something about robbing their own hometown didn't feel right. As they tied their horses in an alley behind the C.M. Condon Bank and the First National Bank, a few townspeople took notice. The men looked suspicious. Their faces were partly hidden and their horses were unfamiliar. Then one man, a store clerk, squinted and whispered, "Aren't those the Dalton boys?" It didn't take long before word spread through the streets. People began running from shop to shop, calling out for guns. The townsfolk of Coffeyville weren't the type to back down. They knew how to handle rifles, and they weren't going to let outlaws steal from their banks without a fight. Inside the first bank, Bob Dalton ordered the tellers to hand over the money. His voice was calm but sharp. He spoke like a man who had done this before. "Quickly now," he said. "No one needs to get hurt." Meanwhile, Grat and Power went into the second bank. They filled their sacks with gold coins and paper bills, demanding access to the vaults. The clerks hesitated, buying time. They told the gang the vaults were on a time lock and couldn't be opened for 10 minutes. That was a lie, but it worked. Those few minutes gave the townsmen just enough time to surround the area. By now, the Dalton Brothers had split between the 2 banks, and things were starting to go wrong. From the street outside, they could hear shouting, the sound of men gathering, the click of rifles being loaded. Bob looked out the window and saw armed citizens hiding behind barrels, doorways, and wagons. He knew instantly what had happened. They had been recognized. "Get ready," Bob said quietly. "We'll have to shoot our way out." As the gang tried to leave, gunfire exploded from both sides of the street. The air filled with smoke and chaos. Bullets shattered windows, tore through wooden walls, and ricocheted off the stone buildings. The townspeople of Coffeyville fought back with everything they had. Shopkeepers, blacksmiths, even farmers grabbed their rifles and took aim. Bob and Emmett tried to run toward their horses, carrying sacks of money that were now slowing them down. Grat Dalton and Bill Power followed close behind, firing back at the attackers. Dick Broadwell covered the rear, shooting as he ran, but there was nowhere to hide. Every corner of the street was filled with armed men. Bob Dalton was the first to fall. A bullet struck him in the chest as he turned to fire again. Grat was hit moments later, collapsing near the steps of the bank. Bill Power tried to crawl to safety, but he was hit too. Dick Broadwell managed to mount his horse and ride out of town, but he was bleeding badly. He died later that day, miles from Coffeyville. That left only one man still breathing. Emmett Dalton, Emmett, just 21 years old, was shot again and again, in the arm, the leg, and the back, but somehow he kept moving. He dragged himself toward his dying brothers, calling their names, trying to pull them out of the line of fire. The townspeople shouted at him to surrender, but Emmett refused to leave his brothers behind. Finally, one last bullet hit him hard, and he fell beside Bob and Grat. His body was riddled with 23 gunshot wounds. Everyone believed he was dead. When the smoke cleared, the scene was horrific. 4 of the gang were dead. The street was covered with dust, broken glass, and blood. The bodies of Bob and Grat Dalton were laid out on the ground beside their fallen companions. The Coffeyville townsfolk had defended their home and won. They had killed one of the most wanted outlaw gangs in the West. To them, it was justice. To others, it was tragedy. The final act of men who had once stood for the law, now dying as criminals in the very town they once protected. But the story didn't end there. Miraculously, Emmett Dalton survived. He was pulled from the street, unconscious and bleeding, but still alive. Doctors worked for hours to keep him breathing. Against all odds, he lived. When he woke up days later, he was in handcuffs. His brothers were gone, and he was the last Dalton left to face judgment. In the months that followed, the story of the Coffeyville Raid spread across the nation. Newspapers printed the faces of the Dalton Gang under bold headlines. Some called them fools. Others called them heroes of rebellion. But everyone remembered them. The Dalton Gang had become legends, not because they lived long, but because they dared to do what no one else would. They robbed 2 banks in broad daylight in their own hometown and paid the ultimate price. And for Emmett Dalton, the youngest of the brothers, the nightmare was only beginning. He would soon face prison, redemption, and a second chance at life. A story that would continue long after the guns of Coffeyville fell silent. When the gunfire stopped in Coffeyville, silence fell heavy over the town. Smoke drifted above the shattered windows, and the smell of gunpowder hung in the air. The Dalton Gang, once feared across the West, lay broken in the dirt. Bob Dalton was dead. Grat Dalton was dead. Bill Power and Dick Broadwell were dead. Only one man still breathed. Emmett Dalton, the youngest of the brothers, just 21 years old. He was lying beside his fallen brothers, bleeding from 23 bullet wounds. The townspeople thought he wouldn't live through the hour. Yet somehow he did. Emmett was carried from the street and laid on a table inside a nearby store. Doctors were called immediately, working for hours to remove bullets and patch torn flesh. They couldn't believe he was still conscious. At one point, a doctor leaned over him and said quietly, "Son, you ought to be dead." Emmett, weak but still aware, whispered, "I guess it wasn't my time." He drifted in and out of sleep for days. When he finally opened his eyes again, his hands were chained to the bed. He was now a prisoner of the state of Kansas, the last surviving member of the Dalton Gang. In the days that followed, people from miles around came to Coffeyville to see the aftermath. Crowds gathered around the bodies of Bob and Grat, which were laid out for public viewing. The Daltons had been both admired and hated, heroes to some, villains to others. Reporters filled the newspapers with sensational headlines. The Dalton Gang wiped out. "Outlaws destroyed in Coffeyville?" They described the brothers as bold, reckless, and doomed by pride. But few people spoke of Emmett, the boy who had survived. When Emmett was strong enough to travel, he was moved to the county jail. His trial began soon after. He was charged with robbery and murder, even though it was clear he hadn't killed anyone that day. The court wanted justice, and for many, Emmett was the only one left to punish. During the trial, he sat quietly, pale and thin from his wounds. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Emmett only replied, "I have nothing to say except that I regret what we did. I wish we had never gone to Coffeyville." His honesty did little to save him. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. At first, prison was hell. Emmett was sent to the Kansas State Penitentiary, a dark, cold place filled with hardened criminals. The guards watched him closely. Some mocked him, calling him the boy outlaw, but Emmett wasn't like the others. He didn't fight. He didn't complain. Instead, he worked hard, kept to himself, and followed every rule. Over the years, his good behavior began to earn respect, even from the guards. They saw that he wasn't cruel or violent. He was young, foolish, and deeply regretful. While in prison, Emmett had plenty of time to think. He thought about his brothers, Bob's ambition, Grat's loyalty, and the choices that had led them all to ruin. He thought about his mother, who had lost nearly all her sons to violence. And he thought about the people of Coffeyville, who had done what they had to do. In his cell, he began to write letters, to family, to friends, and sometimes to strangers who sent him words of sympathy. He spoke of repentance, forgiveness, and the lessons he had learned the hardest way possible. Years passed. Slowly, people began to see Emmett not as a criminal, but as a man who had paid his price. After serving 14 years, Emmett Dalton was finally pardoned in 1907 by the governor of Kansas. When he walked out of prison, He was no longer the boy who had ridden with his brothers. He was a man of 35, quiet, humble, and deeply changed. He decided never to return to crime again. Instead, he moved to California, married his longtime sweetheart, Julia Johnson, and tried to start a new life. For the first time, Emmett had peace. No gunfights, no fear, no running. But his story didn't end there. People still recognized the name Dalton. Reporters followed him, asking for interviews, wanting to hear every detail about the gang's life and downfall. Eventually, Emmett agreed to tell his story. In 1918, he published a book titled Beyond the Law, describing his early life, the Coffeyville Raid, and his years in prison. Later, in 1931, he released another, When the Daltons Rode. The second book became famous and even inspired a Hollywood movie years later. Emmett himself appeared in early films, playing small roles and speaking about his past. Through his writing and public talks, Emmett Dalton tried to turn his story into a lesson. He spoke about how easy it was for good men to lose their way, and how hard it was to find redemption afterward. He often said, "We thought we could beat the law." But in the end, the law always wins. He spent the rest of his life living quietly, far from the wild days of his youth. Emmett Dalton passed away in July 1937 at the age of 66. He was the last Dalton standing, the only one to outlive the gang and tell their story himself. His life became a symbol of transformation, proof that even an outlaw could find forgiveness if he had the courage to change. The Dalton Gang had fallen in a storm of bullets, but from their ashes rose a man who turned his pain into wisdom. The story of Emmett Dalton reminds us that the past can't be undone, but it can be understood. And sometimes, surviving is not the end of a story, it's the beginning of a new one. When Emmett Dalton stepped out of prison in 1907, the world had changed. The Wild West was fading. The days of gunfights, stagecoaches, and train robberies were almost gone. The frontier towns that once feared outlaws were now growing cities filled with automobiles and telephones. For Emmett, it felt like stepping into a different century. He was older, weaker, and marked by scars, reminders of the bullets that had nearly killed him in Coffeyville. But he was also free. After 14 long years behind bars, he was ready to start again. He moved west, hoping to leave the past behind him. In California, he found a quiet life, and something even rarer for a man like him: forgiveness. Emmett married Julia Johnson, a woman who had waited for him through his entire prison sentence. Their love story was simple but strong. Julia believed in him when no one else did. She helped him find work, kept him away from trouble, and encouraged him to live honestly. They settled in Los Angeles, where Emmett took small jobs in construction and real estate. To the neighbors, he was polite and quiet, just another hard-working man trying to build a better life. Few people realized that this gentleman had once been one of the most feared outlaws in the West, but the past has a way of following you. Every so often, a stranger would recognize his name, Dalton. Someone would ask, "Are you one of those Daltons?" And Emmett would nod with a half-smile that carried both pride and regret. In time, people's anger toward the Dalton Gang began to fade. The new century was fascinated with tales of the Wild West, stories of outlaws, sheriffs, and dusty towns where men settled disputes with six-shooters. Emmett realized something. His story wasn't just a memory anymore. It was history. Reporters began to visit him, curious about what really happened that day in Coffeyville. At first, Emmett refused to talk. But later he saw a chance, not for fame, but for truth. He wanted people to know that the Dalton Gang's story wasn't just about crime and greed. It was also about family, mistakes, and the thin line between right and wrong. In 1918, Emmett published his first book titled Beyond the Law. It was part confession, part warning, a detailed account of his life, his brothers, and the decisions that destroyed them. He didn't glorify the gang. Instead, he wrote with humility, describing the pain of losing his family and the years spent behind bars. The book sold well. Readers were fascinated by the idea of a real outlaw speaking honestly about redemption. For the first time, people saw Emmett not as a villain, but as a man who had paid dearly for his choices. As time went on, Hollywood began to take notice. The film industry was booming in California, and Western stories were the heart of American cinema. The names of Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and the Dalton Gang appeared in scripts, movie posters, and stage shows. Producers approached Emmett with an idea. Why not make your life into a movie? He hesitated. He didn't want to glorify the violence, but he saw it as a chance to tell the story right, to show how pride and desperation had destroyed his brothers. And so, in 1931, Emmett Dalton released his second book, When the Daltons Rode. It was more detailed, more personal, and written with the help of a journalist named Jack Youngmeyer. This time, Hollywood listened. In 1940, 3 years after Emmett's death, Universal Pictures turned the book into a major film, When the Daltons Rode. It starred Randolph Scott and Broderick Crawford, two of the biggest names of the time. The movie was dramatic, colorful, and full of action, though it changed many facts for the sake of entertainment. But behind the Hollywood version, there was still Emmett's truth, the memory of brothers who had lost their way and a man who had spent his life trying to make peace with it. Before his death, Emmett himself had appeared in several early Western films, often as a consultant or small extra. He even acted in one silent picture, helping directors understand what the Old West had really looked and felt like. To young filmmakers, he was living history, a man who had seen the end of one world and the birth of another. By the time Emmett Dalton passed away in 1937, he had become something rare, an outlaw turned author, a criminal turned moral storyteller. He died peacefully at his home in Los Angeles, far from the gunfire of Coffeyville, surrounded by people who respected him. His wife Julia said he never spoke of the gang with pride, only with sorrow and reflection. He often said, "I was young and foolish and I paid the price. But if my story keeps one boy from following the same path, then maybe it was worth something." In the decades that followed, the Dalton Gang became part of American legend. Their story was retold in books, songs, and television shows. Some versions made them heroes, others made them villains. But the truth, Emmett's truth, was far more human. They were brothers who loved each other, made bad choices, and paid dearly for them. They lived in a time when survival meant bending the rules, and when justice was as wild as the land itself. Emmett Dalton's journey from outlaw to Hollywood storyteller reminds us that even the darkest past can lead to redemption, if a man is willing. To face it, he didn't just survive history, he helped write it. Years after the smoke cleared over Coffeyville, the story of the Dalton Gang refused to die. Their names, Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton, became part of the American frontier's folklore, whispered in saloons, written in newspapers, and later printed in history books. People were fascinated by them. Some called them cold-blooded killers. Others saw them as misunderstood men, rebels against a cruel and unfair system. The truth was somewhere in between. The Dalton brothers had been both, lawmen and outlaws, heroes and villains, and that duality made their story unforgettable. In the years following the Coffeyville Raid, the Wild West began to change. The frontier closed. The railroad stretched from coast to coast. The gunfights that once defined America's edge became history, replaced by stories, memories, and myths. And within those myths, the Dalton Gang stood tall, just like Jesse James before them and Billy the Kid after. They were symbols of a disappearing era, a time when men lived fast, died young, and made their own rules. But unlike most outlaws, the Dalton story wasn't just about violence. It was about family, three brothers, bound by blood and loyalty, who tried to escape a life of struggle and found only tragedy. The legend started almost immediately after their deaths. Reporters wrote dramatic articles, often exaggerating what had happened in Coffeyville. Some claimed the Daltons had planned to rob 3 banks. Others said they had hundreds of men waiting outside town. Each retelling made the gang larger than life. Tourists began to visit Coffeyville, wanting to stand where the outlaws had fallen. The town became famous overnight, and local merchants even sold postcards showing the Dalton bodies laid out after the gunfight. It was gruesome, but it was history. The same people who once feared the gang now told their story proudly, as if the Daltons had somehow made Coffeyville famous. Over time, songs and poems were written about them. Folk singers in the early 1900s performed ballads about the Dalton boys, painting them as tragic heroes who fought against the rich and died bravely. One song began, "They rode out bold to Coffeyville, with hearts both proud and grim. to rob the banks that robbed the poor and met their fate within. The real Daltons hadn't been noble outlaws, but stories like these blurred the line between truth and myth. People loved the idea of men who stood up to power, even if they broke the law doing it. Hollywood and the media continued to build on that image. By the 1930s and 1940s, the Dalton Gang appeared in comic books, dime novels, and motion pictures. Each version changed the facts a little, sometimes turning them into heroes, other times into ruthless criminals. But no matter how the story was told, one thing stayed constant. The Daltons mattered. Their names represented the spirit of rebellion that still fascinates people to this day. Writers compared them to Robin Hood, stealing from the rich railroads, outsmarting the law, and living free. Of course, the truth was less romantic. The Daltons had wanted money, respect, and recognition. They got all three, but only after they were gone. For Emmett Dalton, who lived long after his brothers' deaths, watching his own past become a legend was strange. He once said, "I never meant to be famous. I just wanted to live." But history doesn't ask what a man wants. Through his books and interviews, Emmett tried to show the human side of their story, the pain, regret, and family love that most people ignored. He wanted the world to remember not just the shootout, but the years before it, the times when the Daltons wore badges and tried to do good. But legends have a life of their own. Once the story left his hands, it became bigger than him. In the decades after his death, historians began to study the Dalton Gang more seriously. They uncovered letters, court documents, and eyewitness accounts. They found that the gang's path to crime wasn't sudden. It was built slowly, out of frustration, poverty, and disappointment. They weren't born criminals. They became them. The story became a window into the real West, a reminder that outlaws weren't always monsters. Sometimes they were ordinary men who made the wrong choices at the wrong time. Today, more than a century later, the name Dalton still sparks curiosity. Coffeyville, Kansas has preserved the history with pride. Visitors can walk down Death Alley, the exact place where the gang fell in 1892. They can see the old banks, the bullet holes in the walls, and the exhibits that tell their story. Every year, the town holds events reenacting the famous gunfight. Actors dressed as the Dalton Brothers ride into town, guns blazing, only to fall again before cheering crowds. It's a show now, entertainment, but it's built on real blood and real lives. What began as a desperate act of greed turned into one of the greatest legends of the American West. The Dalton Gang became immortal, not through victory but through failure. Their downfall became their legacy. They remind us of how thin the line is between law and lawlessness, between justice and vengeance, and how every choice we make shapes the story others will tell about us. Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton were not perfect men. They were brave, foolish, loyal, and flawed, everything that makes a story worth telling. And that's why, more than 130 years later, people still remember their names. The Dalton Gang may have died in Coffeyville, but their legend never did. Long before the Dalton Gang became outlaws, they were just another frontier family, honest, hardworking, and poor. Their story began in the rolling hills of Cass County, Missouri, in the mid-1800s, a time when America was still divided by war and survival meant labor from sunrise to sunset. Their father, James Lewis Dalton, was a farmer, strong, quiet, and determined. Their mother, Adeline Younger Dalton, was a woman of deep faith and fierce courage. The Dalton family had 12 children, 10 boys and 2 girls. Each one taught the same values: respect, loyalty, and hard work. But poverty hung over them like a storm cloud. The land was rough, money was scarce, and every season brought new hardship. Still, Adeline made sure her children grew up believing that honesty mattered more than wealth. She taught them to pray before meals and to help their neighbors. No one could have guessed that 3 of those boys, Bob, Grat, and Emmett, would one day trade the Bible for a gun. The Dalton children grew up wild and free. They worked in the fields, broke horses, hunted game, and learned to ride before they could read. Their world was full of danger, rattlesnakes, outlaws, and the constant threat of war on the horizon. When the Civil War swept across Missouri, it left scars that never healed. The Daltons were surrounded by violence. Soldiers from both sides marched through their land, stealing food and livestock. Many families were divided. Brothers fought against brothers. Adeline did everything she could to keep her sons out of trouble, but the chaos around them changed them. They learned early that sometimes the law couldn't protect you, and that justice didn't always come from a courtroom. After the war, the family moved west, hoping for a fresh start. They settled for a time in Coffeyville, Kansas, and later near Kingfisher in Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. The Dalton boys were growing fast, restless, and ambitious. Their older brother, Frank Dalton, became the first in the family to wear a badge. He was brave, fair, and determined to bring order to the wild frontier. As a deputy U.S. Marshal, Frank hunted horse thieves and murderers across Indian Territory. The younger Daltons admired him. Frank's bravery gave the family pride until tragedy struck. In 1887, Frank Dalton was killed in the line of duty. He had been chasing a group of outlaws when a gunfight broke out near the Arkansas River. Frank was shot and killed instantly. News of his death hit the family hard. Adeline was heartbroken. Her strongest son, the one who had upheld the law, was gone. Bob, Great, and Emmett took it personally. They swore they would honor Frank's memory. They decided to follow in his footsteps and join law enforcement. And for a time, they did. By the late 1880s, Bob and Grat Dalton were working as deputy marshals under Judge Isaac Parker, known as the Hanging Judge. They rode through dangerous lands, hunting down outlaws just like Frank once had. Emmett, the youngest, often worked alongside them. People in the territory respected the Dalton brothers. They were brave, quick with a gun, and always brought in their prisoners alive when they could. But even as they upheld the law, they saw its unfair side. They risked their lives every day, yet earned barely enough to live. Meanwhile, railroad tycoons, crooked land agents, and wealthy ranchers grew richer and more powerful, often escaping punishment for their crimes. Bob Dalton, sharp and ambitious, began to grow bitter. He believed that honest men were fools in a world ruled by greed. It was a dangerous thought, one that slowly turned him away from the badge he wore. Family loyalty kept the brothers close, but desperation pushed them toward darker paths. After losing their jobs as marshals, Bob and Grat began working for the railroads, guarding trains and delivering mail. But one accusation changed everything. A shipment of money went missing from a train under their watch. The company blamed the Daltons. There was no solid proof, but their reputation was ruined. Humiliated and angry, Bob decided he'd had enough of serving others. He said, "If they think we're outlaws, maybe we should give them what they want." That was the spark that started everything. In 1890, the Dalton brothers gathered a few trusted friends and planned their first robbery. It wasn't about revenge or wealth, not at first. It was about pride, about taking control of a world that had never given them a fair chance. They told themselves it would be just one job, quick and clean. But once they crossed the line, there was no turning back. The same courage that had made them good lawmen now made them dangerous criminals. They rode fast, planned smart, and hit hard. And just like that, the Dalton Gang was born. Looking back, it's easy to see the irony. The Daltons had started as defenders of the law, raised by a mother who believed in right and wrong. They wanted justice for their fallen brother. But life on the frontier had a way of twisting men's hearts. For every choice they made, there had been another path, one they never took. And that is what makes their story so haunting. The Dalton brothers were not born to be outlaws. They were shaped by hardship, loss, and the cruel lessons of a land that offered little mercy. Their story began not with greed, but with grief. And that grief would follow them all the way to Coffeyville. By 1890, the Dalton brothers had crossed the line from lawmen to outlaws. It began quietly with whispers and rumors, small crimes that no one could prove. But soon the whispers grew louder. The Dalton brothers, once deputies of the law, were now being hunted by it. At first, they hid their new life well. Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton knew the law from the inside. They knew how marshals thought, how posses moved, and where the weak points were. It gave them an advantage. They weren't reckless bandits. They were strategic. And that's what made them dangerous. The Daltons' first big score came in 1890, when they robbed a train near Wharton, Oklahoma Territory. It was bold, fast, and clean. They stopped the train at night, surrounded it, and demanded the safe be opened. The passengers were terrified, but no one was hurt. The Daltons took the cash, tipped their hats, and disappeared into the darkness. The newspapers couldn't believe it. Some thought it was the work of a new gang. Others suspected surviving members of the James Younger gang, which had terrorized the Midwest years earlier. But soon people began to connect the dots. The Daltons, once trusted marshals, were now wanted men. Bob Dalton was the leader. He was young, charming, and fearless, the kind of man people naturally followed. He had a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Bob wanted to be more than just an outlaw. He wanted to be remembered, to outshine Jesse James himself. Grat Dalton was the muscle. He was steady and loyal, but more cautious than his brother. He often tried to slow Bob down, warning him not to take unnecessary risks. But Bob's ambition was unstoppable. Emmett, the youngest, followed out of love and loyalty. He wasn't ruthless like Bob or bold like Grat. He just wanted to stand by his brothers, and that loyalty would cost him dearly. After the success of their first robbery, the Dalton Gang grew. They were joined by Bill Power, Dick Broadwell, and Charlie Bryant, men who were good with guns and shared the same hunger for danger and wealth. Together they formed one of the tightest, most organized outlaw groups in the West. They struck again, this time hitting trains in California and Indian Territory. Each robbery was planned like a military mission. They knew the schedules, the routes, and even the names of the guards. The railroads called them Ghost Riders because they vanished into the wilderness before anyone could chase them. The gang's biggest early success came in May 1891, when they robbed a Southern Pacific train near Alila, California. They forced the engineer to stop the train in a remote area, then blew open the express car with dynamite. They made off with thousands of dollars in gold and cash. It was a clean escape, or so they thought. The next morning, every lawman in California and Oklahoma Territory was after them. Wanted posters went up in every town. The Dalton brothers' faces were everywhere, offering rewards for their capture, dead or alive. But Bob loved it. He read every newspaper article about himself, laughing at the way they called him the daring new Jesse James. He told Emmett once, "If we're going to be outlaws, we might as well be famous ones." That desire for fame became his obsession. But the outlaw life wasn't as easy as it looked. They were constantly on the run, sleeping in caves, hiding in abandoned cabins, and riding hundreds of miles to escape posses. They lived on the edge of hunger and exhaustion, trusting no one but each other. One by one, things started to go wrong. Charlie Bryant was captured and killed during an escape attempt. Grat was arrested in California and charged with train robbery, though the evidence was weak. He managed to escape from jail and rejoin his brothers, but the law was closing in fast. The Dalton Gang had made too many enemies, and the reward money was tempting too many bounty hunters. Still, Bob refused to quit. He believed the gang could pull off one last job, one big score that would set them up for life. He planned to rob a train carrying a fortune in gold from the rail company's safe. That attempt, however, went terribly wrong. The gang derailed the train, but the explosion from their dynamite damaged most of the loot. They escaped with only a fraction of what they'd expected, and nearly lost their lives in the process. Tensions began to rise. Grat wanted to lay low. Emmett wanted to leave and start fresh. But Bob had other plans. By 1892, the Dalton Gang was famous across the country. Their robberies made headlines from Kansas City to San Francisco. To the public, they were legends, the last true outlaws of the dying Wild West. But to the law, they were a disease that had to be wiped out. Bob Dalton, feeling the pressure, made a decision that would seal their fate. He told his brothers he wanted to do something no outlaw had ever done before: rob two banks at the same time in the middle of the day in their hometown of Coffeyville, Kansas. Grat thought it was madness. Emmett tried to stop him, but Bob wouldn't listen. He said it would make them immortal, bigger than Jesse James, bigger than anyone. He promised that after this job, they'd all retire rich. But deep down, even Bob must have known, this wasn't just another robbery. It was the beginning of the end. As the gang prepared for the Coffeyville Raid, their faces hardened, their laughter faded, and the easy confidence they once carried turned into a quiet tension. They had started their journey as brothers chasing survival. Now they were riding toward history and toward their deaths. The Dalton Gang was about to make their final stand, and the world would remember it forever. The summer of 1892 was the last summer the Dalton brothers would ever see together. By then, they had become famous across the West, their names printed in every newspaper, their faces on every wanted poster. To some, they were folk heroes. To others, they were the devil's own riders. But fame had its price. The law was closing in, and the Dalton Gang was running out of places to hide. They had spent weeks drifting through Indian territory, moving from camp to camp, always one step ahead of the marshals hunting them. Each morning began with silence, no laughter, no talk of plans beyond the next day. Even the horses seemed tired, their breath heavy in the hot prairie air. Bob Dalton, the leader, was restless. His mind was burning with one idea, one last perfect job that would make them legends forever. One night, under a blanket of stars, Bob gathered his men around a campfire. There were only 5 of them left: Bob, Grat, Emmett, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell. Their faces were hard, their clothes worn from years on the run. Bob leaned forward and said, "We've robbed trains, banks, stagecoaches, but no one remembers the ones who play it safe. I say we go out big, something no outlaw's ever done before." The others listened quietly. The fire cracked between them. "We'll rob 2 banks," Bob said, his eyes gleaming. At the same time, in Coffeyville, for a long moment no one spoke. Then Grat shook his head. "Coffeyville? Are you out of your mind, Bob? They know us there. We grew up in that town." Emmett looked at his brother with worry. "We'll be recognized the minute we ride in." But Bob only smiled. "That's what makes it perfect. They'll never expect us to be foolish enough to try it. One last job and we're done. No more running." It was madness, but to men who had lived by the gun, it sounded almost like destiny. For the next few days they prepared quietly. They cleaned their rifles, mended their coats, and studied the map of Coffeyville. Bob had it all planned. The First National Bank and the C.M. Condon Bank stood just across the street from each other. If everything went right, they could hit both in under 15 minutes and ride out before anyone knew what happened. Emmett, the youngest, wasn't convinced. He wanted to stop, to walk away, to live a normal life. He had dreams of buying land, marrying, and leaving the past behind, but he couldn't leave his brothers. He once told a friend, "I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't let them ride into danger without me. Family came first." And so, against his better judgment, Emmett saddled his horse and joined them. In the early days of October 1892, the gang rode through the Kansas plains toward Coffeyville. The nights were cold, the days long. They traveled by back roads and river trails, keeping to the shadows, stopping only to rest their horses. Along the way, they joked less, spoke little, and carried a strange calm, the kind that comes when men have already accepted their fate. Each of them knew the odds. Deep down, they understood what was waiting for them, but no one turned back. When they reached the outskirts of Coffeyville, they camped one last night under a line of cottonwood trees. The lights of the town glimmered in the distance, warm, peaceful, unaware. Bob stared toward those lights for a long time, his jaw tight. He wasn't thinking of escape or money. He was thinking of glory. He wanted to be remembered. Not just as an outlaw, but as a legend who had done the impossible. Grat lay silently nearby, his thoughts far away. Emmett cleaned his gun, hands shaking slightly, trying to calm himself. Dick Broadwell and Bill Power whispered about the plan one more time. It was the last night any of them would ever see. The next morning, October 5th, 1892, the sun rose bright over Coffeyville. The gang dressed carefully, disguising themselves with long coats and false beards. They didn't want to be recognized, not yet. They tied their horses in an alley behind the banks, just as Bob had planned. From a distance, they looked like traveling cowboys, dusty, quiet, nothing unusual. The streets were calm. Children played near the general store. Men gathered outside the barbershop, reading newspapers. It was a perfect morning, too perfect. Grat looked around and muttered, "I've got a bad feeling about this." Bob ignored him. He straightened his hat, checked his revolver, and said, "Let's make history, boys." As the Dalton Gang split into 2 groups, Bob and Emmett heading for the First National Bank, and Grat, Power, and Broadwell for the Condon Bank, the town continued to move in peace. No one yet realized that 5 of America's most wanted men were walking through their streets, but fate was already moving against them. A shopkeeper glanced up and froze. He recognized Bob's face, older now but unmistakable. Within seconds, whispers turned into shouts. Men ran for rifles. The trap was already closing, but the Daltons didn't know it. They were walking into their own funeral. Inside the banks, the robbery began. Outside, Coffeyville armed itself. The gunfight that would end the Dalton Gang was only minutes away, and as the clock ticked closer to noon, the dusty little town of Coffeyville prepared to write its name, and theirs, into history forever. It was a little after 9 in the morning when the Dalton Gang rode into Coffeyville, Kansas. 5 men, disguised in long coats and false beards, guided their horses quietly down the dirt street toward the center of town. They looked calm, confident, as if they had done this 100 times before. But underneath the surface there was tension. Even the horses seemed uneasy. The gang tied them in a narrow alley behind the banks, right between Isham's hardware store and the stable. That small mistake, leaving their escape route trapped by fences and barrels, would seal their fate. The plan was simple. Bob and Emmett Dalton would rob the First National Bank. Grat Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell would rob the C.M. Condon Bank across the street. They'd move fast, take the money, and ride out before anyone could react. But Coffeyville wasn't just any town. It was their town, the place where they had grown up, where everyone knew their faces. As soon as the 5 men walked onto the street, heads began to turn. A store clerk named A.C. Isham glanced through his shop window and froze. He whispered to a friend, "That looks like Bob Dalton." Within minutes, word spread like wildfire. Men ran through the streets shouting, "The Daltons!" "The Dalton Gang is here." Shopkeepers locked their doors. Farmers grabbed their rifles. The town was about to become a battlefield. Inside the First National Bank, Bob Dalton stepped up to the counter and smiled. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said calmly. "We're making a withdrawal, and we're not putting it back." The clerks hesitated, staring at him in disbelief. When Bob and Emmett drew their guns, the truth hit them. It was a robbery, and the robbers were the Dalton Brothers. They forced the employees to open the safe and hand over the cash. Bob was quick, efficient, the voice of a man who'd done this before. Emmett kept watch by the door, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for what was coming. Across the street, Grat Dalton and his partners were inside the C.M. Condon Bank doing the same. Grat demanded the safe be opened, but the teller lied, saying it was on a time lock. While they waited, the minutes ticked away. Precious, deadly minutes. Outside, the townspeople were arming themselves. From the hardware store, men carried shotguns, revolvers, and rifles. Even the local blacksmith and barber joined the fight. Coffeyville wasn't going to be robbed without resistance. When Bob Dalton stepped to the window of the First National Bank, he saw men crouching behind wagons and barrels. He turned to Emmett and said quietly, "We've been spotted." He knew then the plan was lost. But pride wouldn't let him quit. "We'll shoot our way out," he said, "just like we always do." At 9:30 a.m., the first shot rang out. A bullet shattered the window of the bank, whistling past Bob's head. Then another, and another. The gang ducked for cover, firing back through the glass. Outside, Coffeyville erupted in chaos. Gunfire echoed down the street, men shouted orders, and smoke filled the air. The sound of bullets striking wood and glass drowned out everything else. Bob and Emmett burst through the bank's front door, returning fire as they ran for the alley. Across the street, Grat and his crew did the same. The quiet town of Coffeyville had become a war zone. Grat Dalton made it only a few steps before he was hit. A rifle bullet tore through his chest, throwing him backward onto the sidewalk. Bill Power fell beside him, clutching his stomach. Dick Broadwell, badly wounded, staggered toward his horse. Bob Dalton, seeing his brother fall, tried to reach him, but a bullet struck him square in the heart. He collapsed in the dirt, his gun still clutched in his hand. Emmett ran to help, calling out, "Bob! Bob!" He was hit once, twice, 3 times, but somehow kept moving. He dropped to his knees beside his brother, trying to lift him. Then another volley of gunfire tore through the air. A bullet struck Emmett in the back. Then another hit his arm. He fell over, bleeding but still alive. In the space of just 12 minutes, it was over. When the smoke cleared, 4 members of the Dalton Gang lay dead. Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell. Only Emmett Dalton was alive, shot 23 times, but somehow breathing. He was dragged from the street by angry townsmen who wanted to finish him off, but the sheriff stopped them. "Let him live," the sheriff said. "He's paid enough." The townspeople stood over the bodies in stunned silence. It had all happened so fast, less than 15 minutes from start to finish. The Dalton Gang, who had once outrun every posse in the West, was gone. The bodies of the dead outlaws were laid out side by side for public viewing. Hundreds came to see them, the infamous brothers who had dared to rob 2 banks at once. It was a grim end to a story that had begun with ambition, pride, and family. Emmett Dalton was taken into custody, weak and barely conscious. He asked only one question: "Are my brothers dead?" When the sheriff nodded, Emmett closed his eyes. Tears rolled down his face, mixing with the dust and blood. He whispered, "Then it's over," and it was. The Dalton Gang was finished, their story written in gunfire, smoke, and sorrow. The town of Coffeyville had survived, but the legend had just begun. In death, the Daltons became immortal, symbols of the wild spirit that defined the American frontier. They had dreamed of making history, and in a way, they did. When the gunfire faded in Coffeyville, the dust settled over the broken bodies of the Dalton Gang. 4 men, Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell, lay dead in the street. Their dream of glory had ended in blood and silence. But one man still breathed: Emmett Dalton, the youngest of the brothers. He was just 21 years old, shot 23 times, and barely clinging to life. The townspeople dragged him from the street, angry and shouting. Some wanted to finish him off. "He deserves it," one man cried. But the sheriff stepped forward and stopped them. "No," he said. "Let him live. Let him face the law." And so, while his brothers were carried to their graves, Emmett was carried to a jail cell, the last Dalton standing. Doctors worked day and night to save him. Each bullet wound told a story: 1 in the arm, 2 in the back, 1 through the hip, several through his legs. Everyone believed he would die within hours. But Emmett Dalton refused to give up. He drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by the echo of gunfire and the faces of his brothers. When he finally awoke days later, his body was wrapped in bandages, and his hands were cuffed to the bed. A deputy sat beside him, silent and watchful. The doctor leaned in and said softly, "You're lucky to be alive, son." Emmett turned his head and whispered, "No, sir. Lucky men don't lose everyone they love." The trial came months later. Still weak from his wounds, Emmett was brought before the court in chains. He stood pale and quiet, his voice barely above a whisper. The newspapers called him the boy outlaw. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager to see the last living Dalton. When asked if he had anything to say for himself, Emmett spoke simply. "I wish we'd never gone to Coffeyville. I wish we'd listened to reason, but it's too late now. I'm the only one left to pay for what we did." The judge sentenced him to life in prison. The courtroom was silent. Emmett bowed his head. He didn't cry. He didn't argue. He just said, "I reckon I deserve it." Prison life was harsh. He was sent to the Kansas State Penitentiary, a cold stone fortress where daylight was rare and kindness rarer still. At first, many inmates mocked him. Some admired him. Others tried to test him, wanting to see if the stories were true. But Emmett didn't fight. He worked quietly, obeyed every rule, and kept to himself. He spent hours thinking about his brothers, about how close they once were, and how greed had torn them apart. In time, even the guards began to respect him. He wasn't the wild outlaw they had expected. He was calm, thoughtful, and remorseful. Years passed slowly behind those walls. But with each passing day, the boy who had followed his brothers into the banks of Coffeyville began to disappear. In his place grew a man, older, wiser, and at peace with his mistakes. After 14 years, the governor of Kansas granted Emmett Dalton a pardon in 1907. When the prison gates opened, Emmett stepped into the sunlight, a free man for the first time since the day of the gunfight. He was 35 years old, with scars that told his story better than any words could. He vowed never to pick up a gun again. Emmett moved to California, where he married Julia Johnson, the woman who had written to him throughout his years in prison. Together they began a quiet life, far from the ghosts of the past. He worked in real estate, built small houses, and tried to live simply. For a while, the world forgot his name, but history has a long memory. In time, journalists found him again. They wanted to hear his story, the true story of the Dalton Gang, from the man who had lived it. At first, Emmett refused, but later he realized that if he didn't tell it, others would twist it, so in 1918 he wrote his first book, Beyond the Law. It was honest and reflective, not a glorification of crime, but a warning. He wrote, "No man ever beat the law. We thought we could, but in the end, it beat us all." His words reached across the country. People saw him not as a villain, but as a man who had suffered and learned. Years later, in 1931, he published another book, When the Daltons Rode. It became a sensation, retelling the rise and fall of the gang through his eyes. The book even inspired a Hollywood movie, released after his death, keeping the Dalton legend alive for a new generation. Emmett Dalton died in 1937, at the age of 66. He passed away peacefully in his Los Angeles home, far from the dust and gunfire of the plains. The boy who had once robbed banks for glory had spent the second half of his life seeking redemption, and, in many ways, he found it. When people asked him, near the end, if he regretted it all, he would pause and say, "Yes, but I'm still grateful I lived long enough to learn the lesson." The Dalton Gang's story began with ambition, burned through tragedy, and ended in forgiveness. They lived fast, they died young, but one brother lived to tell their truth. In the end, Emmett Dalton didn't just survive history, he rewrote it. His life proved that even in the darkest corners of the Wild West, redemption was still possible. And though the Dalton Gang rode into Coffeyville to steal gold, what remains of them today is something far more valuable, a story of family, failure, and the eternal search for forgiveness.